She was just a waitress in a tired old café, moving through the morning rush with quiet grace. No one noticed the bruises on her arms from endless shifts, or the weight she carried keeping her younger brother's future afloat. But then an aging man with a cane walked in, and everything changed. What began as a simple cup of coffee became a bond that would be tested by fear, danger, and choices neither could escape. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The cafe on 3rd Street was already alive before the sun had fully risen. Its neon sign flickered in the gray light of morning, buzzing faintly above the glass door that swung open and shut with the rhythm of the early crowd. Inside, the air carried the warm, clinging scent of coffee grounds and fried bacon, a smell that seemed to have seeped into the walls. After decades of service, the booths were worn, their red vinyl patched in places with duct tape, and the counters bore the faint scratches of years of clattering plates and restless elbows. It was the kind of place where no one came for elegance, but for the familiarity of eggs cooked the same way every day, and coffee that was always poured before you had to ask. Behind the counter, moving with quiet urgency, was Serena Clark. At 26, she looked older than her years when exhaustion settled in her eyes. But there was still a softness to her face that hinted at the girl she had once been. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, a few loose strands sticking to her cheek as she carried 2 plates stacked with pancakes toward a booth of truck drivers who had already begun arguing about routes. Her sneakers squeaked faintly against the tiled floor, and the small pad tucked into her apron pocket was covered in scribbled orders written so quickly even she sometimes had to squint to make them out. Serena had been working this diner for nearly 5 years. To the regulars, she was dependable, polite, efficient. To the owner, she was steady, someone who could cover shifts without complaint. But beyond the greetings and the smiles, she carried a life most never saw, a small apartment 2 blocks away where her younger brother Alex was still asleep, his textbooks scattered across the kitchen table. At 19, he was trying to put himself through community college, and though he insisted he could handle the tuition, Serena knew her extra shifts were the only reason he hadn't dropped out. As she balanced mugs of steaming coffee and set them down with practiced precision, her mind ticked through numbers. Rent was due in a week. Power bill had come in higher than usual. Alex's tuition payment would be deducted from her account in 3 days. The math never quite added up, but somehow she kept finding a way to make it work. She didn't dwell on the unfairness of it. Life had taught her long ago that fairness was a luxury. What mattered was surviving with dignity. Even when dignity came with a grease-stained apron and sore feet, the bell above the door jingled again, and Serena glanced up automatically. More regulars filtered in, an older couple who always shared a single omelet, a tired nurse still in scrubs, a pair of high schoolers who would pay for 1 coffee and stretch it between them for an hour. Serena's smile shifted as easily as the plates in her hands. She was friendly, but it was the kind of friendliness that didn't invite questions. People knew her name. Few knew her story. The morning rush built into its familiar rhythm, the sizzle of bacon, the clatter of silverware, the low hum of conversations overlapping like background static. Serena moved through it like a dancer, weaving between tables with speed and balance, never colliding, always arriving at just the right moment. Every now and then, she paused just long enough to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, or to stretch her wrist when no one was looking. Life, in many ways, mirrored the diner itself. Resilient, dependable, modest. Nothing about it shone at first glance, but if you looked closer, you saw the quiet strength in the way she carried herself, the persistence in how she kept showing up, day after day. She had dreams once, vague ones about travel or art or maybe even opening her own place one day, but they had been packed away, replaced by lists of bills and shift schedules. Now her dreams belonged to her brother, to his education, to the hope that his life might not be defined by the same struggles. As Serena refilled a customer's coffee, one of the truck drivers made a joke that drew laughter from his table. She smiled faintly, but her eyes were distant, watching the steam rise from the pot in her hand. She thought about Alex's upcoming exams, about whether she could pick up the Sunday shift, about the envelope of overdue notices tucked into her purse. Yet when the customer looked up and thanked her, she nodded warmly, as though none of it weighed on her. For most, the cafe was just a stop before the real business of the day began. For Serena, it was the business, the foundation of everything. She managed to hold together. Each plate she set down was more than a meal, was another step toward keeping a roof overhead, another contribution toward her brother's future. And though the world outside might never notice, inside those worn walls, Serena Clark kept moving, kept smiling, kept enduring. Carrying more than just trays across the diner floor, the diner's morning rhythm carried on like a familiar song. Clinking dishes and murmured conversations filling the air, when Serena noticed the door swing open. The bell chimed, and in walked the man who had become part of her routine, though most people barely looked up when he entered. Harold Whitmore, tall once, now stooped by the slow weight of years, leaned heavily on a worn cane as he made his way toward the booth by the window. It was always the same seat, second from the end, where the light spilled in through the glass and reflected off the silver napkin holder. He moved slowly, deliberate in each step, but there was no frailty. In his presence, he gave the impression of someone who carried more than age, someone who carried time itself. Serena grabbed a menu out of habit, but set it back before she reached him. She knew he wouldn't need it. Harold never ordered more than black coffee. And a slice of toast, sometimes buttered, sometimes dry. The ritual was always the same. He would fold his cane against the wall, settle into the booth with a faint sigh, and let his eyes rest on the street outside, as if the world beyond the glass held more interest than the chatter inside. His suit jackets were outdated, but always neatly pressed, his shoes polished, though scuffed at the toes. There was a quiet dignity in his appearance, the kind that made you pause if you really looked. Most people didn't. They saw an old man, a body moving slowly, another face in the background of their mornings, but Serena had spent years noticing things other people missed. The way Harold's hands lingered over the handle of his cup. Not shaky, just careful. The way his eyes softened whenever a child passed the booth, a fleeting flicker of warmth before returning to their distant gaze. She had never asked what he thought about as he sat there, but she had the feeling his mind lived partly in the present and partly somewhere far away. She brought his coffee, before he had to ask. He always offered the same quiet thank you, his voice low and gentle, a sound that suggested kindness worn thin by solitude. She set the toast down beside it, the steam curling up between them, and noticed once again how he always paused before, taking the first bite as though saying grace silently in his head. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, and his eyes turned from the window to her. They were pale, clouded slightly with age, but not dull. There was clarity in them, the kind that made you straighten under his gaze. "Good morning, Miss Clark," he replied, his words measured. He had asked her name once, months ago, and had never forgotten it. Few customers ever bothered. She smiled faintly, adjusting the coffee pot in her hand. "The usual keeps you going?" "It does," he said, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "At my age, you learn not to complicate the morning." She nodded, moving on to another table, but she kept him in the corner of her vision as she worked. Other waitresses teased her sometimes for how much attention she gave him. To them, he was a man who tipped small and talked little, someone whose presence faded into the background noise of the cafe. But Serena couldn't shake the feeling there was something more behind his quiet routine, something no one else bothered to see. Harold lingered longer than most customers, often finishing his coffee long after the breakfast rush had cleared. He seemed to find comfort in the steady clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation around him, as if the diner itself kept him tethered to the world. Serena wondered if he lived alone. His clothes spoke of someone who still valued presentation, but his eyes betrayed a loneliness she recognized too well. When her shift slowed, she found small excuses to stop by his booth, refilling his coffee before the cup was half empty, or wiping down the table next to his. Sometimes he spoke, telling her small stories about the neighborhood when it had been different, about a bookstore that used to sit on the corner or a theater long since demolished. He never lingered on details of himself, never mentioned family. It was as though his stories were a map of the city without him in it. Serena listened anyway. She had learned that some people didn't need questions. They just needed someone to hear the fragments they were willing to give. And in those fragments, she began to see Harold differently. Not as the lonely old man the world dismissed, but as someone carrying a history that weighed more than his cane ever could. To others, Harold Whitmore was just another regular. To Serena, he was a reminder that dignity doesn't vanish with age, that sometimes the richest stories are hidden in the quietest corners of a café, and though she didn't yet know why, she felt a pull toward him, an intuition that his story wasn't finished, and somehow hers would soon be part of it. The morning had started the same as always, with the clatter of plates and the faint hum of the jukebox that hadn't been updated in years. Serena moved from table to table, balancing coffee pots and plates with the rhythm of someone who had long since learned to glide through chaos. The cafe was full that day, the booths crowded, with office workers grabbing quick breakfasts before their shifts and construction crews in reflective vests speaking in low, tired voices. Amid it all, Harold Whitmore sat at his usual place by the window, cane tucked against the wall, eyes turned outward as if the world beyond the glass mattered more than the din inside. She brought him his order. It's the same as always, black coffee and toast, but that morning, perhaps out of habit or perhaps because something in him wanted more, he added scrambled eggs. It wasn't unusual, but Serena noticed the hesitation in his voice when he asked. She didn't think much of it until she came back a few minutes later with the plate and saw him trying to cut the eggs with slow, careful movements. His knife slipped, the fork wavered, and she saw the faint tremor in his hands. She lingered at the counter for a moment, watching from the corner of her eye. Customers struggled sometimes, new parents with restless babies, older men too proud to admit their coffee had gone cold, teenagers fumbling with coins, but there was something about Harold's effort that drew her. He wasn't clumsy, deliberate, as though his pride demanded he keep trying even as his body betrayed him. Finally, Serena set her towel down and crossed the floor. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, standing beside his booth. His eyes flicked up, startled, then softened with recognition. "Yes, Miss Clark." She gestured lightly to the plate. "May I?" For a moment he hesitated. His jaw tightened, pride wrestling with need. Then, slowly, he slid the plate toward her. She took the knife and fork, cutting the eggs into smaller pieces with a care that made it seem less like help and more like a shared ritual. When she placed the utensils back in his hands, she smiled faintly. There, easier to manage. He looked at the plate, then back at her, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said quietly, "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but the way he said them carried weight, not just gratitude for the gesture, but something deeper, as if no one had stepped in for him in a long time. Serena nodded, offering no comment that might embarrass him, and started to move away. "Sit for a moment," he said suddenly, his voice softer than usual. She glanced at the counter, no urgent orders waiting, then slid into the opposite side of the booth. For the first time since she'd known him, Harold looked directly at her, not at the street outside or the coffee cup in his hands. His eyes were pale but sharp, and his voice carried the cadence of someone used to being listened to. "You remind me of my daughter," he said. Serena tilted her head. "You have children?" he corrected quietly. The silence that followed was deliberate, as if he had chosen that single word carefully. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. Instead, she watched as he picked up a forkful of eggs, steadier now, and chewed with the patience of someone lost in memory. "I've lived a long life," he continued after a moment, eyes distant. "Longer than I expected, truth be told. When you get to my age, the past becomes louder than the present. Every face you see reminds you of another you once knew. Every kindness feels like something you should have given back long ago." Serena folded her hands on the table, listening. He wasn't telling her everything, not the details, not the names or places, but she could hear the outline of loss in his words, a quiet ache that no amount of time could soften. "Most people walk past me as though I'm invisible, he said, almost to himself. But you don't. You notice. His gaze met hers again. Steady now. That matters more than you know. Serena felt her throat tighten, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because she had grown used to being unseen herself, her own. Struggles hidden behind practiced smiles and quick steps across the diner floor. To hear him speak the same truth that invisibility weighed, heavy at both ends of life, made her chest ache. She gave him a small nod, not wanting to break the fragile moment with the wrong words. Sometimes noticing is the least we can do, she said quietly. He studied her face as though committing it to memory, then leaned back against the booth. The conversation drifted after that small things about the weather. The way the city had changed, stories of streets that no longer existed as they once had. He spoke with the precision of someone who had seen decades pass, but he never gave away too much. Always fragments, never the whole picture. When Serena rose to return to her shift, Harold touched the edge of his cup and said, "You've been kind, Miss Clark. Don't let the world take that from you." She carried those words with her the rest of the morning, tucked somewhere between the ringing of the diner bell and the scrape of dishes in the sink. God, it wasn't much, just a small exchange over a plate of scrambled eggs, but it felt like the start of something neither of them could quite name. The diner felt different at night. The morning rush and afternoon chatter gave way to a quieter hum, kind of silence that pressed against the windows and left only the clink of cutlery or the low murmur of a late-night customer. Serena had taken the evening shift to cover for a coworker, and by the time the clock neared 10, most of the booths were empty. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, casting a red glow across the rain-speckled glass. The air smelled of coffee that had been brewed too many times, and the jukebox in the corner had long since gone still. Harold was still at his booth. It was unusual for him to stay so late, but tonight he lingered over his coffee, his cane propped against the wall as always. He had spoken more than usual earlier in the evening, telling Serena about an old bakery that used to sit down the block before it burned in the 1960s. Now he sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the reflections in the window. Watching the few cars that passed on the slick street, Serena wiped down the counter, humming faintly under her breath. The diner wasn't closed yet, but it was close to winding down. She didn't mind staying late. She preferred the calm after the storm of the day. Besides, Harold's presence made the room feel less empty. There was comfort in knowing she wasn't entirely alone. The door swung open suddenly, the bell above it giving its cheerful chime, but the mood shifted immediately. Two young men stepped inside, their hoods pulled low over their faces, shoulders tense in a way that didn't belong to weary travelers or late-night diners. Serena straightened instinctively, her hand tightening around the rag she was holding. One of them moved quickly toward the counter, his voice sharp. "Open the register now." The other scanned the room, his eyes catching on Harold in the booth. Serena felt her pulse quicken. The diner wasn't in the kind of neighborhood where crime was rare, but she hadn't faced it so directly before. For a split second she thought of pressing the panic button under the counter. But Harold's faint cough drew her eyes, and something in her tightened. She stepped out from behind the counter, her body moving before her mind caught up. She crossed the space to Harold's booth and stood in front of him, her frame a barrier between the thieves and the old man. "There's no need for trouble," she said, her voice steady despite the fear thudding in her chest. The taller of the two men sneered. "Move. We're not here for him." Serena shook her head, her stance firm. "You want the register? It's there. Take it, but you're not touching him." For a moment, the room was caught in a strange silence, the rain tapping against the windows the only sound. The younger thief shifted uneasily, glancing toward the door as if considering whether this was worth the risk. The taller one stepped closer, his expression hardening, slammed his hand on the edge of the table, startling Harold, whose cane tipped and clattered to the floor. Serena flinched, but didn't move. She bent down quickly, picked up the cane, and handed it back to Harold without breaking eye contact with the man in front of her. Her hand trembled slightly, but her gaze stayed firm. "You don't scare me," she whispered, the thief's jaw clenched, his hand balling into a fist as though weighing whether to strike. Just then, a faint wail of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Serena realized with relief that when she had stepped out from behind the counter, she had brushed her hand against the panic button without even thinking. The thieves exchanged a panicked glance. The younger one tugged at his partner's sleeve. "We gotta go." The taller man swore under his breath, glaring at Serena as though committing her face to memory, then turned and bolted toward the door. Both disappeared into the night just as the sirens drew closer, red and blue lights reflecting. Against the rain-slick glass, Serena exhaled shakily, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. She turned back to Harold, who sat stiffly in the booth, his coffee untouched, his eyes wide and unsettled. He looked older than she had ever seen him, as if the years had pressed down on him all at once. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You're safe," she said gently. His gaze lifted to hers, and for the first time, she saw not just weariness in his eyes, but something raw, almost vulnerable. He nodded slowly, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply held onto his cane with white knuckles, as if anchoring himself. By the time the police arrived, the thieves were long gone, leaving only the echo of their footsteps and the unease that hung in the diner. Serena answered questions, her voice steady, though inside she still felt the echo of fear. When the officers finally left, Harold remained seated, silent, his coffee gone cold. Serena sat across from him, the night suddenly heavier than it had been before. She didn't know why she had stepped in so quickly, only that something in her refused to let harm come his way. And in the silence that followed, as the neon sign buzzed faintly above them, she knew that something had shifted between them. Something neither of them yet understood. The moment stretched thin, like the air itself had forgotten how to move. The taller of the two thieves hovered close to Serena, his jaw tight with anger, while the younger one's gaze darted nervously around the diner. Harold shifted uneasily in the booth, his cane slipping from his hand as though sensing what was about to happen. The clatter of wood on tile broke the fragile silence, and in an instant, everything unraveled. The younger thief lunged first, grabbing for the cane as if it were a trophy or a weapon, something he could use to establish control. Harold's startled cry cracked through the room, and Serena reacted without thinking. She stepped into the thief's path, her body angled. Between him and the old man, one hand pushing against his chest to slow him down. "Leave him alone," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the chaos. The taller thief shoved her hard to the side, the sudden force sending a jolt of pain up her arm as she stumbled into the counter. Her shoulder collided with the edge, and for a moment, white-hot pain radiated down to her wrist. She gasped, but caught herself before falling, her breath quick and uneven. Her eyes flicked to the register. Just inches below it, hidden beneath the counter, was the small red button every worker hoped they'd never have to use. As the younger thief tugged at Harold's cane, trying to yank it from his frail grip, Serena shifted her weight and slid her hand back toward the counter. She pressed the button with a firm, deliberate push. The faint click was lost under the noise of the scuffle, but she felt it like a pulse under her skin. Somewhere miles away, yet suddenly closer than ever, the police would be on their way. The taller thief noticed her movement. His eyes narrowed, and he grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it to pull her away from the counter. Pain shot through her muscles, but she refused to cry out. She looked at Harold instead. His face was pale, fear etched into the lines around his mouth, his trembling hands clinging desperately to what little stability the cane offered. "Stop." Serena's voice broke as she tried to wrench free, but the man only tightened his grip. The younger one succeeded in tearing the cane from Harold's grasp. The old man gasped and collapsed back into the booth, suddenly vulnerable without it, his body sagging like a house with its frame torn away. The sight ignited something fierce in Serena. With her free hand, she swung at the taller thief, landing a blow against his shoulder. It wasn't strong enough to hurt him, but it was enough to startle him, enough to shift his balance. She twisted out of his hold, though the movement wrenched her arm painfully. Her breath came ragged, but her eyes burned with defiance. "Take the money if you want," she said, her voice shaking but unyielding. but you don't lay a hand on him." The taller thief laughed bitterly, a humorless sound that carried more menace than amusement. "You think you can stop us?" Serena didn't answer. She stood firm, her body a shield in front of Harold, who sat frozen. His hands pressed flat against the table as though bracing himself. For a moment, all Serena heard was the rapid thud of her own heartbeat. She knew help was on its way, but in that suspended time, minutes felt like hours. The younger thief gripped the cane tightly, brandishing it as if testing its weight. His face flickered with hesitation. He wasn't as hardened as his partner. Serena could see it in the way his hands shook, in the way his eyes darted to the door again and again. She focused on him. "Put it down," she urged, her tone soft but steady. "That's not yours. Just leave." But before he could respond, the taller one lunged again, shoving Serena back with a blow that struck her arm and nearly knocked her off her feet. Pain flared hot and immediate, and she staggered, clutching her elbow instinctively. She bit down, hard on the inside of her cheek, to stop from crying out. Harold, trembling, tried to rise, but without the cane, his legs faltered. It was chaos contained within four walls, raw and sudden. Serena forced herself upright again, ignoring the throbbing pain in her arm. She stepped forward once more, putting herself between Harold and the men. Her chest heaved, but her eyes stayed steady. She wouldn't back down, not while Harold sat. Defenseless behind her, the faint wail of sirens broke through the night then, distant but growing. The sound made the younger thief flinch. He glanced at his partner, panic flashing across his face. "We don't have time," he hissed. The taller one scowled, glaring at Serena with a mix of rage and frustration. For a moment, it looked as though he might strike again, but the rising sirens made the choice for him. With a sharp curse, he turned, dragging his partner toward the door. The cane clattered uselessly to the ground as they bolted into the night. Serena stood frozen, her arm throbbing, her breath shallow. The door slammed shut, and the sudden quiet left her shaking. She turned back to Harold, who sat rigid in the booth, his eyes wide, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven bursts. She bent down, retrieved the cane, and placed it back in. His trembling hands— "You're safe," she whispered, her voice soft now, as though speaking too loudly might shatter him. He clutched the cane like a lifeline, his knuckles white, and for the first time since she'd met him, Harold's composure cracked. His eyes glistened, and though no words came, the look he gave her carried more than gratitude. It carried recognition, as if in that moment he saw her not just as a waitress, but as someone who had chosen to stand when the world told her to move aside. The door banged shut behind the thieves, their footsteps fading into the night just as the sirens grew louder. For a long moment, the diner was still except for the hum of the neon sign and the ragged sound of Harold's breathing. Serena stood in the center of the room, her chest rising and falling, her arm aching from the blow she had taken. The adrenaline that had carried her through the chaos began to slip away, leaving behind a heaviness that made her legs tremble. She forced herself to breathe steadily, to hold on to calm, because Harold was watching her with wide, unsettled eyes. He sat hunched in the booth, his cane clutched tightly, his knuckles pale against the worn wood. His shoulders shook, not with anger, but with something quieter, more fragile fear that had finally breached the surface. The old man who so often sat in dignified silence was stripped bare in that moment. Serena moved slowly toward him, not wanting to startle him, and knelt beside the booth. Her arm throbbed where she had been struck, but she ignored it. "It's over," she said softly, her voice steady in a way she didn't quite feel. "They're gone." Harold's lips parted as though to reply, but no words came. Darted toward the door, then back to her, his breath coming in uneven pulls. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, grounding him. The warmth of her touch seemed to reach through the fog of his panic, and he blinked slowly, trying to steady himself. Sirens swelled, red and blue lights flashing through the rain-streaked windows, painting the walls in shifting colors. Within moments, the door burst open again, this time with the heavy footsteps of officers. Behind them, the wail of the sirens died, replaced by radio chatter and clipped questions. Serena stood, answering what she could, recounting how the men had come in, how they had demanded money, how they had grabbed at Harold. Her voice didn't waver, though her body still trembled under the surface. She mentioned pressing the panic button, described the way they had fled, but she kept her focus steady, glancing back toward Harold every few sentences to reassure herself. He was still there. An officer approached him asking if he was hurt. But Harold only shook his head faintly, gripping his cane like a man holding onto a lifeline. He hadn't spoken yet, not more than a whisper. The officer gestured toward the paramedics waiting outside, and Serena stepped closer, lowering her voice. "It's okay," she said. "Let them check you, just to be sure." A moment he resisted, his pride stiffening his shoulders, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Finally, he gave a small nod. The paramedics moved in gently, checking his pulse, shining a light into his eyes, asking if he felt dizzy. He answered softly, haltingly, each word careful, as though his voice might break under the weight of them. While they worked, one of the paramedics turned to Serena. "What about you?" he asked, noticing the way she held her arm close to her body. She shook her head quickly. "I'm fine." But Harold's eyes shifted, locking on her for the first time since the men had gone. His gaze, pale and sharp despite the years clouding them, traced the faint bruise already blooming across her skin. "You're hurt," he said, his voice low but certain. Serena offered a small smile. "Just a bruise. I've had worse carrying trays." It was a weak joke, but something in it seemed to pull him back, if only slightly. His breathing slowed, and he watched her with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Not just the polite acknowledgement he usually gave when she refilled his coffee, not just the distant courtesy of a man who kept his thoughts to himself. This was different. His eyes lingered, searching her face as though trying to memorize it. You stood in front of me," he whispered finally, the words almost disbelieving. "Of course I did," Serena replied gently. "Danger." He shook his head slightly, as though struggling to reconcile the truth of it. For years he had sat in that booth, invisible to most, unnoticed, beyond a passing glance. Tonight someone had seen him clearly enough to protect him without hesitation. That realization seemed to weigh on him as much as the fear had. The paramedics finished their checks, assuring him there were no serious injuries. They suggested he rest, maybe go to the hospital for further evaluation, but Harold refused. He wasn't ready to leave just yet. Instead, he sat back in the booth, still pale, still shaken, but calmer now. His hand resting lightly on the cane Serena had returned to him. The officers lingered, filling out paperwork, taking statements. When they finally left, the diner grew quiet again. Serena eased into the seat across from him, cradling her sore arm. The silence between them wasn't empty, was heavy with everything unspoken, with gratitude, with recognition. Harold's eyes stayed on her, softer now, almost reverent. "You didn't have to," he said at last. Serena leaned forward, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Maybe I didn't, but I couldn't just stand by." His expression shifted, the faintest smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile that carried sorrow behind it, as though kindness was both a gift and a reminder of what had been lost. Still, he held her gaze longer than he ever had before, and in that look was something close to recognition. Of who she was exactly, but of what she had done, of what she had chosen to be, in a moment when no one else had. The fear hadn't fully left him, or had the tremor in his hands. But there was something new in his eyes now, something fragile, but real. For the first time, Harold looked at Serena not as a waitress bringing him coffee, but as a person who had stood between him and the world, someone who mattered. And though neither of them said it aloud, they both understood that nothing between them would ever be quite the same again. The bell above the diner door chimed softly, its familiar note echoing through the nearly empty room. Morning light poured in through the windows, softer than the neon glow that had filled them the night before. Serena stood behind the counter, pouring fresh coffee into a row of mugs for the first wave of regulars who would soon arrive. She glanced up at the sound of the bell, and for a moment her breath caught. Harold had returned. He moved more slowly than usual, his cane tapping faintly against the tiled floor. His shoulders stooped under the weight of something heavier than age. His clothes were neat as always, but his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the handle of his cane with one and the strap of his worn satchel with the other. When his eyes met Serena's, he hesitated, as though unsure if he should come closer. She gave him a gentle smile, the same one she had given him every morning for months. But now it felt heavier, anchored by the memory of what had happened. He made his way to his booth by the window and sat down carefully, easing into the seat as though his body carried bruises the paramedics hadn't seen. She brought his coffee without asking, setting it gently before him. He wrapped his hands around the cup almost immediately, though the trembling in his fingers made the liquid ripple slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. He nodded, his voice low when he answered, "Good morning, Miss Clark." For a while neither spoke. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen filled the silence. Along with the faint sound of a radio playing a song too low to be made out, Serena moved around the counter, refilling sugar jars and wiping down surfaces, but her eyes kept returning to Harold. He wasn't staring out the window like he usually did. His gaze stayed fixed on the coffee in his hands as though he were gathering the courage to say something. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I owe you something," he said. Serena shook her head lightly. "Don't owe me anything." Icy eyes flickered up to hers, sharp for a moment. "Don't tell me that. You put yourself in front of me when you didn't have to. That's not something people do anymore." Paused, his fingers tightening on the cup. "You remind me of someone I once knew long ago, someone who cared that way, someone who stood up even when it wasn't easy." Serena's hand stilled on the rag she was holding. There was a quiet ache in his voice, one that spoke of memory and loss, though he offered no names, no details. Just a shadow of the past carried in his tone. She didn't push. She only nodded gently, letting him keep his story where it belonged. He shifted, reaching into his satchel with hands that shook more now. After a moment, he pulled out a slim envelope and slid it across the table toward her. "Please," he said, his voice careful but insistent. "Take this. I don't have much left to give, but you deserve something for what you did." Serena looked down at the envelope, the edges slightly frayed, the flap sealed neatly. She didn't touch it. Instead, she met his eyes. "You don't need to buy my kindness," she said softly. "That's not why I did it." Harold's gaze searched hers, as if testing her sincerity. His lips pressed together, and for a long moment he said nothing. Finally, he withdrew the envelope and slipped it back into his satchel, his hands lingering there as though reluctant to let go. "You're different," he murmured, almost to himself. "Most people see me as a burden, invisible at best. But not you." He shook his head faintly. "You don't know what that means." Serena's chest tightened at his words, but she kept her tone gentle. "Maybe I do." For the first time that morning, the faintest smile tugged at the corners of Harold's mouth. It wasn't full or bright, but it was real, and it softened the lines of his face. Lifted the coffee cup again, though his hands trembled so much he nearly spilled. Serena noticed, stepped forward and steadied the cup with her own hand. The simple touch stilled his shaking for a moment. They sat there like that, in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just filled with the weight of things neither could yet say. For Harold, it was the recognition of a kind of loyalty, he thought. The world had long since forgotten. For Serena, it was the realization that kindness didn't always need explanation. It just needed to be offered freely. When another customer walked in and the spell of the moment broke, Harold leaned back, in his seat a little more composed. He tapped the edge of his cane against the floor and gave Serena a small nod. "Thank you," he said again, quieter now, but with a depth that went beyond the words. She smiled, turned and returned to her work, the bruise on her arm throbbing. Faintly, the memory of fear still lingering, yet in Harold's eyes, she had seen something different that morning. Not just politeness, but recognition. And that was enough. By the next morning, the story had already begun to drift through the neighborhood. A diner wasn't the kind of place where secrets stayed quiet for long. Regulars who had been absent the night before arrived with questions, their voices dropping low as though they were sharing a rumor rather than repeating what had happened just beyond those swinging glass doors. "Heard there was some trouble," one man said, leaning against the counter. "Cops were outside." "Late? That true?" Another whispered over a plate of scrambled eggs. She stood right in front of them. "Can you believe that?" The details were hazy, but the whispers were everywhere, riding on the steam of fresh coffee and the hum of conversation. Serena kept moving, plates balanced on one arm, coffee pot in the other. She had no interest in confirming or denying anything. The bruises on her arm were explanation enough. Her coworkers had noticed, of course. Jenny, the youngest of the waitresses, gasped when Serena slipped her apron over her head, catching sight of the dark bloom just below her sleeve. "Oh my God, Serena," she hissed, following her into the kitchen. "You could have been killed." Serena shrugged, setting down an order slip. "But I wasn't." Jenny shook her head, disbelief plain in her expression. "All for some old man who probably doesn't even tip more than a quarter. I mean, what were you thinking?" It wasn't cruel exactly, but the tone stung all the same. Jenny wasn't the only one. Later that morning, while Serena refilled a table of regulars' coffee cups, one of them, a middle-aged man with calloused hands and a voice like gravel, grinned at her in that way people do when they're more amused than impressed. "You've got guts, I'll give you that, but guts don't pay hospital bills. What if they'd had a gun?" He chuckled, shaking his head as though she had been foolish rather than brave. She offered only a polite smile and moved on. What else was there to say? Her boss, Mr. Donnelly, called her into the back after the rush died down. The office was little more than a cramped room with filing cabinets stacked against one wall and an old desk covered in paper. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying her with a mix of sternness and concern. "I should be scolding you," he began, his voice gruff. "We don't pay you to play hero. You've got responsibilities. Something had happened to you, I'd be short a waitress and probably facing a lawsuit." "What?" Serena braced herself for a reprimand. But then, his tone softened. "But then again, I heard what you did. Standing in front of him like that, not everyone would have. Truth be told, most wouldn't." He scratched at the stubble on his chin. "You're tougher than you look, Clark. Just a habit of it." She left the office with a faint smile. That was as close to praise as Mr. Donnelly ever gave. The customers kept talking. Some praised her openly. A nurse on her way home from the hospital reached across the counter to squeeze Serena's hand. "You're a good soul," she said earnestly. "Don't let anyone tell you different." A pair of older women in the corner booth whispered about her as though she couldn't hear, saying they hoped someone like Serena would be around if they ever found themselves in danger. Others weren't so generous. A young man laughed as he paid his bill, muttering all that for some guy who probably doesn't even have a dime to his name. Through it all, Serena remained the same. She smiled where it was expected, nodded when someone tried to press their opinion into her, and kept moving from table to table, her steps unhurried, her voice calm. Inside, she felt no need to defend herself. She hadn't done it for recognition, and she certainly hadn't done it for reward. She had done it because she couldn't imagine doing anything else. At Harold's booth, the whispers seemed to fade. He sat quietly, his hands resting on his cane, his coffee cooling in front of him. If he heard what people said about him, about how little he might be worth, he gave no sign of it. His eyes followed Serena as she worked, a softness in them that hadn't been there before. When she passed, he offered a small nod of gratitude, subtle enough that no one else would notice. The diner buzzed with talk, with opinions and judgments, with praise and mockery all tangled together. But when Serena caught her reflection in the chrome edge of the coffee machine, she saw the same face she had seen yesterday. Tired, maybe bruised, certainly, but unchanged. She didn't feel like a hero, and she didn't feel like a fool. She felt like herself, a woman who had made a choice in a moment of fear, a choice that came from instinct, not calculation. So she shrugged it all off. Let them whisper. Let them argue over whether she had been brave or reckless. None of it mattered to her. What mattered was that Harold was still sitting in his booth, alive, safe, and drinking his coffee. That was enough. The diner had emptied for the night. The last of the coffee cups rinsed and stacked neatly on the drying rack, when Harold lingered at his booth longer than usual. Serena had grown accustomed to his quiet departures, the careful way he would rise with his cane and thank her before disappearing into the evening. But this time, as she untied her apron and slung it over the counter, he cleared his throat softly, drawing her attention. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice tentative but steady. "Would you mind walking me home tonight?" She blinked in. Surprise! In all the time she had known him, Harold had never asked for anything more than toast and coffee. For a moment she wondered if he regretted asking, his pale eyes already drifting toward the window as though preparing for refusal. But Serena smiled, grabbing her coat from the hook by the door. "Of course," she said. "I'd be glad to." They stepped out into the cool night air, the street damped from a light drizzle that had passed earlier. The neon sign of the diner hummed faintly behind them, casting a red glow onto the slick pavement. Harold walked slowly, his cane clicking rhythmically against the sidewalk, and Serena matched his pace without comment. The city around them was quieter than usual, the late hour pulling most people indoors, leaving only the occasional passing car or the distant bark of a dog. His building was only a few blocks away, an old brick structure with iron railings and narrow steps leading up to the entrance. The paint on the door was chipped, but the brass handle gleamed as though someone polished it daily. Inside, the stairwell smelled faintly of dust and polish, the walls lined with faded wallpaper patterned with flowers long out of fashion. Harold's apartment was on the second floor. He moved slowly up the steps, gripping the railing firmly, and Serena stayed close in case he faltered. But he didn't. He climbed with determination, if not speed, until finally he pushed open the door to his home. The apartment was small, but meticulously kept. The first thing Serena noticed was the orderliness of everything. The rug in the entryway was aligned perfectly with the doorframe, the shoes placed neatly on a rack to the side. In the living room, bookshelves stretched along the walls, filled, not with knickknacks, but with rows upon rows of book spines, faded, pages yellowed, but clearly cared for. A reading lamp stood beside an armchair, upholstered in worn fabric, the cushion indented from years of use. On the shelves and end tables, framed photographs were arranged with precision. Serena stepped closer, her eyes drawn to the images. They were old, some in black and white, others faded color prints. One showed a young Harold in a suit, standing beside a smiling woman with dark hair. Another captured a little girl with bright eyes and a wide grin, holding a doll in her arms. Serena felt a pang of recognition, not that she knew them, but because Harold always seemed to carry their absence with him. He noticed her gaze lingering and cleared his throat. "My wife," he said, pointing to the woman. His voice softened. "And my daughter?" Serena glanced at him, but he offered no more. The way he spoke told her the story was complicated, one he wasn't ready to unfold just yet. She nodded gently, respecting the silence, and followed him further into the apartment. The kitchen was tidy, the counters free of clutter, the dishes stacked neatly in the cupboards. A faint smell of old wood lingered, mingling with the scent of paper from the books in the other room. But what caught her attention most were the drawers, two tall filing cabinets pushed against the far wall, each drawer locked with small brass keys. She didn't ask what was inside, but she felt the weight of those drawers in the room, as if they held more than papers. As if they held secrets Harold wasn't ready to let out. He gestured for her to sit, and she settled into the armchair while he lowered himself slowly onto the couch across from her. For a while they didn't speak. The ticking of a clock on the wall filled the silence, steady and unrelenting. Finally Harold leaned forward, his hands clasped around the handle of his cane. "I don't usually invite people here," he admitted. "But after what you did, it felt right to let you see where I live." Serena smiled faintly. "Thank you for trusting me." His eyes lingered on hers, and for a moment it looked as though he might say more.
Ow.
But then he leaned back, the lines of his face softening into exhaustion. "It's late," he said quietly. She rose, slipping her coat back over her shoulders and walked to the door. Before she left, she glanced once more at the photographs on the shelf, the smiling woman, the little girl, frozen in time. She sensed entire lives tucked into those frames, histories locked away, just like the drawers against the wall. As Harold thanked her again, his voice warm but heavy, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that beneath his quiet composure lay a story waiting to surface. When she stepped back into the night, the cool air wrapped around her, and she found herself thinking not of the fear from days before, but of the silence inside Harold's apartment, silence that carried weight, memory, and unspoken truths. The diner was quieter than usual that morning, the steady rhythm of the coffee machine filling the gaps left by the absence of the usual chatter. Serena moved through the familiar motions, pouring coffee, balancing plates, sliding menus across tables, but her thoughts wandered back to the night she had walked Harold home. She had carried the image of his apartment with her ever since. The rows of books, the carefully arranged photographs, and the locked drawers that seemed to hum with the presence of untold stories. There was something about the way he had shown her that space, something fragile and deliberate, that made her feel as though a door had been cracked open just enough for her to glimpse the weight he carried. When Harold arrived, tapping his cane softly against the floor as he made his way to the booth by the window, she greeted him as always with a smile and a fresh cup of coffee. His movements were slower than usual, and when he sat down he seemed more reflective, his eyes distant. Even as he thanked her, she left him alone for a while, tending to other customers. But when the morning rush thinned, she found herself sliding into the seat across from him. For a long time, neither spoke. Harold cradled the cup in his hands, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from it as though the curling wisps held some answer he was searching for. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and steady. "Do you believe in legacy, Miss Clark?" Serena blinked, caught off guard by the question. She leaned back slightly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Legacy?" she echoed. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the cup. "What we leave behind when we're gone. The mark we make, if we make one at all." The question lingered between them, heavy in its simplicity. Serena thought about it, her brow furrowed. Legacy was not something she often considered. Survival, yes. Bills, certainly. Her brother's education, always. But legacy, what she herself would leave behind, felt like a distant concern for people with more time and more choices. She answered honestly, her voice soft but clear. "I don't know if I think about legacy much, not in the way you mean. For me, it's about my brother. Making sure Alex has a chance to build the life he deserves. If I can help him get through school, keep the lights on, give him something better than what we started with, that's enough for me. That would be my mark, I guess." Harold finally looked at her, his pale eyes studying her face with quiet intensity. He didn't interrupt, didn't press. He only listened, as though weighing her words carefully. When she finished, he nodded. Once, then grew silent again. The silence stretched on until it became almost uncomfortable. Serena shifted slightly, waiting for him to respond, but he seemed to drift into thought, his gaze drifting toward the window where the morning light caught on the glass. His lips parted, and he spoke so softly she almost missed it. "Maybe it's time I decide where mine belongs." Serena tilted her head, frowning faintly. "What do you mean?" But Harold didn't answer. He sipped his coffee instead, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the cup. His eyes returned to the street outside, where people hurried by with umbrellas and briefcases, unaware of the weight of his words. She wanted to ask more, to press for clarity, but something in his expression stopped her. It was not secrecy so much as a man wrestling with himself, a man on the cusp of a decision he wasn't ready to share. She let the silence remain. Sometimes she knew words weren't meant to be pulled out before their time. Instead, she reached across the table and straightened the napkin dispenser, a small, grounding gesture. "Whatever it is you're thinking about," she said quietly, "I'm sure you'll know when it feels right. For the first time that morning, the faintest." Smile touched his lips. It wasn't joy exactly, but there was a softness there, a gratitude for her patience. He nodded once more, as if sealing something unspoken between them. The bell over the door jingled as new customers arrived, breaking the moment. Serena rose, smoothing her apron, and slipped back into her work. But the question lingered with her all day, pressing at the edges of her mind. Legacy. For Harold, it clearly weighed heavier than he let on. And for the first time, she wondered if his presence in the diner every day, his quiet routines and his measured silences, were all part of something larger he was carrying with him. As she poured coffee for the newcomers, she glanced back at his booth. He was still there, his cane propped against the wall, his eyes distant. He looked like a man who had already begun writing the ending of his story. And Serena couldn't shake the feeling that somehow she was now a part of it. The first morning Harold didn't appear, Serena noticed immediately. His booth by the window sat empty, the napkin dispenser untouched. The salt and pepper shakers aligned just as they had been left the night before. She poured his usual black coffee out of habit, setting it on the counter as though he might walk through the door at any moment. But the bell above the entrance never chimed for him. By the time her shift ended, she told herself perhaps he had overslept, or maybe the rain had convinced him to stay inside. Old men had their off days. The second morning felt different. She caught herself glancing at the door every few minutes, her stomach tightening when it opened for strangers, but not for him. Customers came and went, the air buzzing with the usual chatter. Yet the absence of one quiet figure seemed to echo louder than all the voices combined. When her break came, she slipped into his booth, her hand brushing over the table's surface. It was strange how much space a person could fill with silence, and how their absence could hollow it out completely. By the third day, worry pressed hard enough that she couldn't ignore it. After her shift ended, she walked a few blocks. To his apartment, the night air was cool, the streets damp from an earlier drizzle, the city humming faintly as though trying to reassure her that life went on as always. But her steps were quick, her heart uneasy. She climbed the narrow stairs she had followed, him up before, and knocked lightly on his door. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time, then leaned her ear against the wood. The apartment inside was silent. She tried the handle, but it was locked. For a moment, she stood in the hallway, her hand resting on the doorframe, the wallpaper's faded pattern brushing her fingertips. She could almost see him inside, sitting. In that worn armchair beneath the lamplight, a book open in his lap, the photographs of his wife and daughter watching over him. But the stillness on the other side of the door told her he wasn't there. She asked a neighbor in the hall, a woman, carrying groceries, if she had seen him recently. The woman shook her head, frowning slightly. Not for a few days. He's quiet, but he's usually around. Serena forced a smile of thanks, though her chest felt heavier. She lingered at the door one last time before finally turning back. Down the stairs at the diner, his absence became something everyone noticed, though few admitted it directly. A couple of regulars asked where the old man had gone. Their voices casual, but Serena caught the curiosity beneath their words. Jenny, her coworker, leaned close behind the counter one afternoon and whispered, "Maybe he just went to stay with family." He must have somebody, right? Serena wanted to believe that, but the photograph she had seen in his apartment told a different story. There had been no family there, only memories carefully preserved, like relics from a life that no longer existed. Days stretched on. Each morning, Serena found herself glancing toward the window booth, the empty seat glaring back at her like a question with no answer. She poured coffee she didn't need to pour, her hand hesitating over the pot before she set it down. She listened for his cane tapping on the tile, but all she heard was the ordinary shuffle of other customers. The worry followed her home. At night, while her brother studied at the kitchen table, Serena found herself staring out the window, replaying Harold's last words in her mind. "Maybe it's time I decide where mine belongs." What had he meant? Yet the thought of him alone somewhere, struggling or worse, gnawed at her. She checked the local news for any mention of an incident involving an elderly man, but found nothing. By the end of the week, she felt the ache of his absence settled deep. The booth by the window no longer felt like part of the diner, felt like a shrine to someone missing. The coffee machine hissed. The plates clattered. Conversations rose and fell, but beneath it all was the hollow space where Harold should have been. No one knew where he had gone, and no one seemed to have the answers she longed for. To the world, he was just another old man who stopped showing up. But to Serena, he had become something more, someone whose silence mattered, someone whose disappearance left a mark no amount of noise could cover. And so she waited, hoping, against the rising fear that eventually the bell above the diner door would chime again, and Harold Whitmore would return to his place by the window. The call came in the middle of a shift, just as Serena was sliding a plate of eggs and hash browns across the counter to a bleary-eyed truck driver. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her apron, a vibration she might have ignored if something in her chest hadn't urged her to answer. She excused herself quickly, wiping her hands on a towel as she stepped into the narrow hallway by the storeroom. "Miss Serena Clark?" The voice on the other end was formal, practiced, carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Yes," she said cautiously. "This is Richard Hall from the firm of Hall and Myers. Tom, I'm calling in regard to Mr. Harold Whitmore." Her stomach dropped. The hallway seemed to tilt slightly, the hum of the refrigerator behind her growing louder. What about him? There was a pause, the kind that stretched too long, heavy with the weight of words waiting to fall. Then the man spoke again, softer. "This time, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mr. Whitmore passed away 2 days ago." She pressed a hand against the wall, steadying herself. "What?" "He left instructions with our office to contact you upon his passing," the lawyer continued, his tone even as though he had rehearsed these lines countless times. "I realize this may come as a shock. Shock wasn't the right word. Was something deeper, heavier." Serena slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold tile floor, her apron bunched around her knees. She barely knew Harold, not in the way people usually mean when they speak of knowing someone. She didn't know his favorite color, the details of his childhood, or the names of his friends. But she knew the way his hands trembled when he held his coffee. She knew the hollow sound in his voice when he spoke of legacy. She knew the weight of his silence and the way it had begun to open, just slightly, in her presence. Somehow that was enough to make her chest ache, as though something vital had been torn away. The lawyer's voice carried on, speaking of arrangements, of documents to be reviewed, of a meeting scheduled at their office. Serena heard the words, but absorbed little of them. She murmured her agreement, wrote down an address with shaky hands, and ended the call. For a long moment she sat there in the quiet hallway, staring at the floor, the hum of the refrigerator pressing against her ears. When she finally returned to the dining room, Jenny raised an eyebrow. "You okay? You look like you saw a ghost?" Serena forced a nod, slipping behind the counter, her hands moving automatically to refill coffee cups and clear plates. But inside, she felt as though the air had changed. Harold would never walk through the door again. His booth by the window would remain empty. Not just for a few days, not just for a week, but forever. The thought clawed at her, unexpected in its force. That night, when she returned home, Alex looked up from his textbooks as she entered, frowning at the expression on her face. "What's wrong?" She sat at the table, folding her hands together, too still there, trembling. "Harold's gone, Harold?" Alex asked. "The old man from the diner?" She nodded. Saying it aloud made the truth settle deeper, heavier. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, though she blinked them away. Quickly, she didn't want Alex to see her unravel. He didn't understand what Harold had come to mean in the quiet hours of her days, how his presence had softened the edges of her routine, how his absence now carved out a hollow that felt disproportionate to the time they had actually shared. That night, lying awake in bed, Serena thought about the last time she had seen him, the way his voice had carried that strange weight when he asked about legacy. She thought of his photographs, his locked drawers, the fragments of a story he had never fully told her. And now he never would. She would never know the whole of who he was, but grief doesn't measure itself in years or details. It measures itself in connection, in the quiet recognition that someone mattered, and Harold had mattered. More than she realized until he was gone, as sleep finally crept in, Serena whispered into the darkness, a simple thank you. For the coffee conversations, for the silent nods, for the reminder that even the quietest presences can leave behind echoes too heavy to ignore. The law office was quiet. The kind of quiet that pressed down on every sound, muting even the shuffle of footsteps on the polished floor. Serena sat in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The bruises on her arm faded now, but still tender, a reminder of the night everything had changed. She had dressed as neatly as she could manage, a plain blouse and slacks. But she still felt out of place surrounded by the varnished wood paneling and the expensive leather chairs. She wasn't sure why Harold's lawyer had asked her to attend. Only that the call had been firm and clear. Her presence was requested at the reading of his will. When her name was called, she stood quickly, smoothing the wrinkles from her blouse, and followed the assistant down a narrow hall into a conference room. Inside, a long table dominated the space. Around it sat several strangers, their faces varying shades of curiosity, impatience, and grief. Serena realized with a jolt that these must be Harold's relatives. People she had never heard him mention, never seen at the diner, never glimpsed. In the photographs that lined his apartment, at the head of the table sat Richard Hall, the attorney who had called her. He stood as she entered, gesturing toward an empty chair at the far end. "Miss Clark, thank you for coming." She nodded and took her seat, aware of the eyes that turned toward her. One woman, dressed in a dark suit, raised her brows slightly, as if questioning what someone like Serena was doing there. A man in his 50s, his tie too bright for the occasion, gave a small snort and looked away. The room carried an unspoken hierarchy, and Serena already felt herself at the bottom of it. The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling the stack of papers before him. "As you all know, we are gathered here for the reading of Mr. Harold Whitmore's last will and testament." His voice was steady, professional, the cadence of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. Yet for Serena, every word felt sharp, cutting closer to something she wasn't ready for. He began with the formalities. The small bequests of personal items to distant cousins, a watch to one, a set of books to another. The relatives nodded, or frowned in turn, their faces betraying whether they were satisfied with what little they were given. Serena listened quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap, expecting at any moment to hear her name dismissed with some brief acknowledgement of gratitude. Then Richard Hall paused, his eyes scanning the page before him. The remainder of Mr. Whitmore's estate, including his residence, financial accounts, and all personal effects not otherwise specified, is to be left to Miss Serena Clark. The silence that followed was absolute. Serena blinked, certain she had misheard. She felt the weight of every gaze turned toward her, sharp and accusatory. The woman in the dark suit leaned forward. "Excuse me? Who? Serena Clark?" the lawyer repeated calmly. "The individual present here today." The man with the bright tie scoffed audibly. "The waitress? You've got to be kidding me." Serena's mouth opened, but no words came. She stared at the attorney, searching his face for some explanation. Some sign this was all a mistake. "There must be," she started, her voice trembling. "There must be some confusion." "There is no confusion," Hall said firmly. Mr. Whitmore was explicit in his instructions. The relatives erupted then, voices overlapping in disbelief and outrage. She barely knew him. This is absurd. He must have been manipulated. The accusations flew, the air thick. With hostility, Serena shrank into her chair, her cheeks burning, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. But beneath the storm of voices, one thought rang louder than the rest. Harold had chosen this. He had thought about it, written it down, made it official. She remembered the question he had asked her about legacy, the way his eyes had lingered when she spoke of her brother, a quiet murmur, "Maybe it's time I decide where mine belongs." Still, the reality felt impossible. She was a waitress barely keeping her life together, not someone who inherited estates and bank accounts. And yet, Harold had seen her, trusted her, chosen her above blood relatives, who now glared at her as though she were a thief. When the voices finally quieted, the lawyer continued, his tone unwavering. Mr. Whitmore expressed great clarity of mind when drafting this will. He emphasized that his decision was deliberate. His eyes flicked briefly towards Serena, a hint of reassurance in them. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for this." "No," Hall said gently, "but it was given to you." The relatives muttered among themselves, but Serena barely heard them. Her mind was spinning, her chest heavy with a mixture of grief, disbelief, and something else she couldn't quite name. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't relief. It was the crushing weight of knowing that Harold had entrusted her with everything he had left behind. When the reading ended and the others filed out in tight-lipped silence, Serena remained seated for a long moment, her hands trembling against the table. She thought of Harold's quiet eyes, his trembling hands around a coffee cup, the way he had looked at her that last morning with something close to recognition. She had never expected to matter in his story, and now she was its ending. The air outside the law office was cooler than it had been inside, yet it carried no relief. Serena stepped onto the sidewalk with the weight of every stare still pressing against her back, as though the relatives' disapproval had followed her. Out the door. She could still hear their voices in her head, sharp and biting, each word a reminder that she didn't belong in that room. They had barely waited for the door to close before the accusations began. "You must have pressured him," the man with the too bright tie had said, his face flushed red with anger. "There's no way he would leave everything to a waitress." No. Woman in the dark suit had been colder, her voice edged with disdain. "We all knew Harold was fragile near the end. It wouldn't have taken much. A smile, a hand on the shoulder, a little flattery. Yes. That's all it takes sometimes." Serena had sat there stunned, her throat tight with disbelief. She wanted to shout back, to tell them they didn't know Harold the way she did. But the words had stuck like stones in her chest. They had spoken with such certainty, as though her kindness had been a weapon, as though every conversation she had shared with Harold had been calculated rather than genuine. The lawyer had tried to intervene, raising his hand and reminding them of Harold's clarity of mind when drafting the will, but his voice had been drowned out. The room had filled with bitterness and resentment, a tide of anger that surged against her like waves, leaving her small and defenseless now, standing. Alone on the street, Serena felt the ache of their words digging deeper than she wanted to admit. She hadn't known Harold long, not compared to family who had grown up with him. Shared blood, shared history. What had she given him, really, besides coffee, toast, and a shield against two frightened thieves? Why had he chosen her when his own family sat right there, waiting, expecting? She walked slowly toward the diner, the city sounds blurring around her. Her arm still bore a faint bruise from that night, a pale mark that had not yet faded. It pulsed now as if reminding her that she hadn't imagined it, that she had stood between Harold and danger when others might have looked away. But did that make her worthy of everything he owned? The question twisted in her chest, heavy with guilt. By the time she reached the diner, the familiar bell above the door jingled, but its sound didn't bring the comfort it usually did. Her co-workers glanced up from behind the counter, and she caught the look in their eyes. Word had spread quickly. In a town this size, it always did. She could see the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Was it true? Would she really inherit it? From the old man by the window, she tied on her apron with stiff hands, forcing herself to move through the motions, but her thoughts kept circling back to Harold. She remembered his trembling hands, his quiet questions about legacy, the way he had seemed to look at her as if searching for someone he recognized. She had never pushed him for anything, never asked for more than his company on quiet mornings. And yet he had given her everything. As the shift wore on, one of the waitresses leaned close when no customers were near. "They're saying his family's furious," she whispered, her tone hovering between curiosity and suspicion. "You sure you didn't, encourage it?" Serena froze, the words slicing into her like another accusation. "I didn't," she said softly, her voice fraying at the edges. "I never asked him for anything." But even as she said it, she could feel doubt stirring in her own chest. Why her? Why not them? The weight of the inheritance didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a burden, a secret too heavy to carry alone. When she finished her shift that night, she walked home slowly, her brother already asleep when she entered their small apartment. She lingered by his door, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. Everything she had done, every sacrifice had been for him. Harold must have seen that somehow, must have recognized it in her, but the family's words lingered. They didn't see her sacrifices. They saw only a waitress who had taken something that wasn't hers. Serena sat at the kitchen table, her hands clasped together, staring at the bruises on her arm and the faint scratches that had not yet healed. She thought of Harold's quiet smile, the way he had looked at her with something close to relief after the robbery. Perhaps he had left her his estate because she had given him something his family no longer could care without condition, loyalty without expectation. But the accusations echoed in the back of her mind, louder than her own justifications. She couldn't silence them. Not yet. She felt crushed under the weight of both grief and doubt, her heart heavy with the question she could not shake. Why her? And in the silence of her small kitchen, with the hum of the refrigerator as her only companion, she realized she might never truly know the answer. The envelope lay heavier in Serena's hands than any piece of paper should. It had been tucked neatly among the legal documents, the lawyer sliding it across the polished wood table with a solemn expression that betrayed nothing. He asked that this be delivered to you directly, the lawyer had said, his tone steady, though his eyes lingered on her with a faint curiosity. Now, alone in her small apartment, with the kitchen clock ticking too loudly above her, she stared at the sealed flap, her fingers hesitant to break it open. It was addressed in uneven, deliberate handwriting. She had seen Harold's script before, in the margins of old books he carried, neat but softened by age, as though every letter was drawn with care rather than written quickly. The ink on this envelope was darker, fresher, but still carried the same weight of thought. To Serena Clark it read. The name looked strange to her, almost foreign, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Her brother Daniel was asleep down the hall? The silence of the apartment pressed close, amplifying her unease. She finally slipped a finger under the flap and tore it gently, the sound sharp and final in the quiet. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper folded in half. She drew it out carefully, smoothing it flat on the table. The sight of his handwriting filled her with something she couldn't quite name, part grief, part reverence, part fear of what the words would reveal. Serena, it began, her name standing alone on the first line. Firm and steady, she read. On, her eyes tracing each letter slowly, as though reluctant to move too quickly through something that felt like his voice reaching across the divide. You may never understand why I have made the choices I did. Others will not. They will call it unfair, perhaps even cruel, and they will look at you with suspicion. But I ask you to carry no shame for what I leave behind. I had very little faith left in people before you sat down at my table that morning. I had grown old, not just in years, but in spirit, tired of seeing kindness traded like currency, always with strings attached. You gave me something I thought I had lost forever. You reminded me that kindness can still be given without expectation. Serena paused, her throat tightening, the words blurring slightly as tears pricked her eyes. She pressed her sleeve quickly to her face before continuing. You did not know me well. You did not ask who I was, or what I owned, or what I could offer you. No. You saw a frail man who struggled to lift a fork, who leaned too heavily on a cane, and you did not look away. When danger came, you stood between me and it without hesitation. That moment will remain with me longer than any possession I leave behind. In you, I saw someone I once knew well, someone I loved dearly and lost too soon. Her breath caught. As her eyes landed on the next line, you reminded me of my daughter. The words struck her like a sudden wind, the room around her tilting slightly. She read them again, slower, as though repetition might bring clarity. Harold had never spoken of a daughter. He had shared fragments of a past, vague mentions of a long life lived, but never anything so personal. Now, the revelation lay on the page, quiet but undeniable. I will not burden you with the details of her absence, only to say that the hole she left in my life never closed. In the way you cared for me without demand, I saw a reflection of her, of what she once gave to me. I leave you what I have not because you asked, but because you gave freely. You gave me back something I lost faith in people. That is worth more than the money, the books, the photographs, or the walls that have kept me company in my solitude." Serena pressed her hand to the page, as though by touching it, she could steady the trembling in her chest. She read the final line slowly, each word weighted with his presence. "You may doubt this choice. Others certainly will. But I ask you, Serena, live without apology. Use what I leave not as a burden, but as a chance. Build the life you dream of, for yourself and for your brother. That will be enough for me. With gratitude, Harold Whitmore." The silence of the apartment felt different now, deeper, as though the words on the page had shifted something unseen. Serena sat there for a long time, staring at the letter, her hands pressed against it, as if she could anchor herself to its truth. The accusations of his relatives still echoed in her memory. But this was Harold's voice, clear and deliberate. He had chosen her, not out of manipulation or chance, but out of recognition. He had seen her not only for who she was, but for what she gave without asking. A tear slipped down her cheek, landing softly on the paper. She folded the letter back into its envelope with care, as though it were fragile, and held it close to her chest. For the first time since the will was read, she felt a measure of peace settle over her. Not all of the doubts were gone, but Harold's words gave her something stronger than defense. They gave her a reason. The letter sat on the table long after Serena finished reading it, its edges illuminated by the faint yellow glow of the kitchen lamp. She had folded and unfolded it so many times that the crease lines now ran deeper, the paper softening at its bends. The words inside clung to her, weaving themselves into her thoughts even as she tried to distract herself with dishes, laundry, or sorting through the pile of unpaid bills that never seemed to shrink. Harold had spoken of a daughter, words that had arrived like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward until everything felt unsettled. She thought back to every conversation she'd shared with him in the diner, replaying them now in her mind with fresh ears. The way he often stared out the window instead of at his plate, how he lingered on certain pauses as though he were holding back stories that threatened to surface. He had mentioned a long life lived more than once, but never explained. Now she wondered if those pauses had been the moments he brushed against memories too sharp to touch. His cane, his deliberate movements, his quiet way of existing, these had always struck her as signs of age. But in the stillness of her apartment, she wondered if they had also been signs of grief. The next day, she found herself drawn back to his booth at the diner. The sun was just climbing through the clouds, filtering weak light through the front windows, and the place was quieter than usual. The seat by the window looked exactly as it had when Harold sat there, his shoulders slightly hunched, his hand resting over his cane as if to steady himself in more ways than one. Serena placed a fresh mug of coffee on the table out of habit, watching the steam rise as though expecting him to arrive at any moment. But the chair stayed empty. She slid into the seat opposite instead, closing her eyes, trying to imagine what stories might have unfolded if Harold had let himself speak freely. The letter gave her hints, but not answers. He had said she reminded him of his daughter. What kind of girl had she been? Did she laugh the way Serena laughed when Daniel cracked one of his sarcastic jokes? Did she work hard, unnoticed, in the way Serena had grown used to? Or had she simply been kind, instinctively protective, just as Serena had been that night of the robbery? The lack of detail made the connection even more haunting, as if Harold had wanted her to understand the echo without painting the full picture. Later, she walked to Harold's apartment, the small, meticulously kept space she had visited once before. With the lawyer's permission, she had been given a key part of settling the estate, and though she hesitated at the door, her need for understanding pulled her inside. The rooms were just as she remembered, books lined up neatly on every shelf, photographs faded with age, drawers locked tight as though guarding secrets. She stepped carefully through the silence, her eyes catching on a framed photo resting on the corner of a bookcase. It showed a young woman in her 20s, smiling with a brightness that seemed to fill the frame. Her dark hair was tied back, and her eyes carried something unmistakable: warmth, resilience, a spark of mischief. Serena didn't need to be told who she was. She knew instinctively that this was Harold's daughter. She lifted the frame and studied it, her chest tightening. There was no date, no caption, only the captured moment of a life now reduced to memory. Looking at it, Serena felt the weight of Harold's words settle differently. His daughter wasn't an abstract loss. She was real, tangible, once alive and laughing, and Harold had carried the ache of her absence for decades, until Serena's small acts of care had cracked open that silence. As she explored further, she found other signs of a life once shared. A music box tucked inside a drawer, worn at its edges. A stack of children's books, their spines faded from use. Small knitted scarf, carefully folded and placed in a cedar chest, as though Harold had preserved it for a winter that never came. These were relics of a story left unfinished. Fragments of a bond that had defined him more than he ever let on. Serena sat on his couch, the photo in her lap, and let the truth settle over her. Harold's quiet dignity, his steady presence, the way he had seemed to watch her, not just with politeness, but with something deeper recognition, it all made sense now. In her, he had found a reminder of love once lost, a presence that reopened a corner of his heart. He had believed closed forever. She felt both humbled and burdened by the knowledge. His trust in her, his choice to leave his estate, to her no longer felt random. It was a reflection of the void she had unknowingly filled, the daughter-shaped space that her kindness had touched. Serena traced her fingers over the photo frame, whispering softly, as if to Harold himself, "I'll take care of it. I'll take care of what you couldn't finish." The apartment was quiet, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like Harold's past had finally begun to speak, and in its echoes, Serena found the beginning of her own new path. When Serena first heard the word estate, she pictured something modest, a tidy savings account, maybe Harold's apartment with its shelves of books and quiet relics. It's enough, perhaps, to ease her debts and help Daniel with school. She never imagined the car ride that followed the lawyer's call, the long drive out of town where streets gave way to winding roads, and the horizon unfolded into open countryside. The vehicle slowed as iron gates came into view, their black, paint-chipped and ivy curling through the bars. Beyond them stretched a gravel drive that led to something Serena could hardly process at first glance. It wasn't a house, it was a mansion. The kind she had only seen in magazines left behind on diner counters, glossy pages that never felt connected to her reality. Its stone facade rose against the sky, weathered yet imposing, the windows framed with shutters that looked like they had stood untouched for decades. Chimneys pierced the roofline, and balconies hung with rusted railings. The lawyer, seated beside her in the car, simply nodded toward it. "This is what Harold left you," he said quietly, as if sensing the words might take time to sink in. Her first steps through the front door felt unreal. The air inside was cool, carrying a faint scent of dust and cedar. The entryway opened into a sweeping hall, its high ceiling supported by beams darkened with age. Light spilled through stained glass panels above the door, casting colored patterns. Across the polished wooden floor, Serena stood there frozen, her diner uniform feeling almost absurd in the grandeur of it all. She had spent years wiping ketchup stains off menus and refilling coffee cups, and now she was standing in a place where chandeliers dangled overhead. Every room she entered seemed to expand her disbelief. A drawing room with velvet curtains drawn, half shut, a library with shelves climbing toward the ceiling, each lined with books whose spines bore the weight of centuries. Dust lay thick on some tables, yet the furniture had been preserved with care, covered in cloth as though Harold had been waiting for someone to return and lift it away. In one corner, a grand piano stood silent, its keys hidden beneath a closed lid. A glass of long-dried water resting on top as if a player had paused mid-song and never returned. The deeper she went, the more she realized this wasn't simply wealth, it was history. Cabinets displayed porcelain figurines, hand-carved boxes, and tarnished silverware that bore initials unfamiliar to her. On a mantel, she found a row of framed photographs, sepia-toned, capturing people in fine clothing. From decades past, none of the faces were ones she recognized, but she felt their gaze linger on her, as though she were intruding into a story she had not been invited to join. What struck her most were the smaller details. In the side parlor, she discovered shelves, filled with music boxes, each one unique, some tiny and delicate, others large with intricate designs. She wound one carefully, and the soft melody that trickled out filled the empty hallways with an ache she couldn't name. The notes seemed to echo Harold himself, the quiet, unspoken longing she had glimpsed in his eyes at the diner. Oh, music had meant something to him once, perhaps shared with his daughter, perhaps left behind when loss grew too heavy in another room. She found drawers filled with letters, bundles tied with ribbon now frayed at the edges. She untied one carefully and skimmed the words written in Harold's neat script decades earlier. They spoke of travels, of war years, of dreams for the future. Some were addressed to a woman whose name appeared again and again, Serena. Imagined her as Harold's wife, though the lawyer only confirmed that she had died long before Serena ever knew him. Each page carried a tenderness that made her throat tighten, as though she were trespassing into moments of love preserved in ink. Walking the halls of the mansion, Serena felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of Harold. The quiet man with the cane and the coffee cup had not simply been an old man with nothing left. He had been the steward of a world, one he had chosen not to flaunt. He had lived with riches measured not just in money, but in memories, in objects, layered with meaning. Now, inexplicably, that world had been handed to her, by the time the lawyer excused himself, leaving her with keys and documents stacked neatly on the hall table. Serena could only stand in the foyer, her arms folded tightly across her chest. The silence pressed and heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. She stared up at the staircase that spiraled into shadow, wondering how one life could change so suddenly, how Harold's past had become. Her present, she didn't feel like an heir. She felt like a trespasser, a waitress walking through a place she had no right to claim. Yet Harold had chosen her, and in every room she entered, she sensed that choice was not just about money or property. It was about trust, about legacy, about passing something fragile into hands he believed would honor it. Serena turned slowly, her footsteps echoing as she walked back toward the front door. The mansion loomed behind her, vast and silent, waiting for her to decide whether she would step into the life it offered or let its history remain. Locked away in shadows, the lawyer's words hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. He sat across from Serena in the high-ceilinged study, the kind of room meant for serious conversations. His leather briefcase lay open on the polished desk, papers spread neatly before him. He adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully, as though rehearsing a script he had delivered to countless heirs before her. "Miss Clark, you need to understand the position you're in. This property, along with the assets Mr. Whitmore left behind, could fetch millions if sold outright. Investors would line up for it. Developers, too. You could walk away today debt-free, set for life." Serena sat still in the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The words "set for life" echoed in her mind, tempting, almost cruel in their weight. For years she had scraped by on diner wages, counting tips, clipping coupons, and carrying the endless responsibility of keeping her younger brother's life stable. To be set for life was more than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. And yet, as she looked around the study, her eyes taking in the shelves lined with Harold's books, the dust still resting gently on the lampshades, she felt a pull in the opposite direction. "I don't think I can do that," she said quietly, surprising even herself with how firm it sounded. The lawyer leaned back, eyebrows raised. "You don't have to decide right away. Most people, frankly, nearly everyone choose to liquidate. It's practical. It's clean. This place is a burden. Maintenance alone will cost more than you've ever dealt with." Serena nodded. She knew he was right. She could already feel the weight of what it meant to keep such a property intact. The leaking roof, the creaking floorboards, the acres of land outside that would need care. It wasn't just an inheritance, it was work. It was cost. But as she stared at the old wooden desk where Harold must have once sat, pen in hand, scribbling letters that now rested in drawers, she felt something stronger than financial logic. Responsibility. Harold had trusted her. Not his relatives who sneered at her, not the business associates who barely remembered his name, but her. The waitress who had once shielded him with nothing but her own body when two desperate boys came crashing into the diner. He had seen something in her, something she wasn't sure she fully believed in herself yet. If she sold everything to the highest bidder, what would that say about the faith he placed in her? She stood slowly, walking across the study to where a painting hung above the fireplace. It was a portrait of Harold in younger years, dressed in a dark suit, his posture dignified, his gaze calm. The man she had known had been older, frailer, leaning on a cane, sipping black coffee with trembling hands. But here, in oil and canvas, was proof that he had once stood tall, commanding a presence far beyond the quiet corner booth of a diner. She met the painted eyes, and in her chest a quiet resolve began to harden. "This isn't mine," she said finally, turning back to the lawyer. "It was never meant to be mine. It belonged to him, and everything in it tells his story. If I sell it, that story gets erased. I can't let that happen." The lawyer frowned slightly, as if he had heard this kind of idealism before and knew how quickly it could fade once reality set in. Still, he nodded, and began shuffling papers back into his briefcase. "Then you'll need a plan," he said. "Because sentiment doesn't pay property taxes." After he left, Serena lingered in the study, the silence pressing in heavy around her. She let her fingers trace the spines of books she had never read, paused over the glass dome of an old clock, and wound one of Harold's music boxes until its fragile notes filled the room. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It wasn't wealth she heard in those notes, nor obligation, it was memory. A man's life etched into objects, waiting to be seen, not sold. For the first time since receiving the call about Harold's passing, she felt a clarity settle inside her. This was not ownership. It was stewardship. She had been entrusted, not enriched. The thought didn't make the burden lighter, but it made it meaningful. Whatever came next, the bills, the legal battles, the endless cleaning and repairs, she would face them. Not for herself, but for Harold. For the quiet dignity of the man who had left her more than money. He had left her a legacy, and she intended to honor it. The first morning, she walked through the grand entryway with a hammer in her hand, instead of a serving tray. Serena realized her life had split in two. There was the woman she had been, the diner waitress, balancing plates and scraping by with whatever tips came her way, and then there was the woman standing here, staring at the wide staircase and the cracked banisters, responsible for something bigger than herself. A mansion felt hollow, almost like a shell waiting to be filled with life again. Dust floated in beams of sunlight through tall windows. Every creak beneath her shoes reminded her how much work lay ahead. Yet beneath the decay, she saw a possibility. It began small. Serena called a few friends from the diner, people who had always stood by her, even when customers mocked her for giving too much of herself. She explained what she wanted to do: not sell, not hoard, but transform the mansion into something living again, a good place for the town's forgotten. Seniors who spent their days in lonely apartments, children who wandered streets with nowhere safe to go after school. Building as large as Harold's estate couldn't just sit silent. It needed voices, laughter, footsteps that mattered. At first, people shook their heads, warning her she was dreaming too big. "You can't run a place like this alone," her boss at the diner said, handing her a box of nails as a kind of peace offering. "But if anyone's stubborn enough to try, it's you." Others followed hesitantly, bringing tools, paint, and time on weekends. Soon the dusty halls echoed with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and shouted instructions as neighbors and strangers alike joined in. Something about Serena's conviction drew people in. She worked until her arms ached, scrubbing floors, repainting walls, and hauling broken furniture out to the yard. Every room carried a story. A grand piano in the parlor was polished until it gleamed, though a few keys remained out of tune. The old library was aired out, its shelves reorganized into a lending section. Even the attic, filled with trunks of Harold's belongings, was carefully sorted. She found photographs, clothing, and journals. Rather than hiding them, she displayed some in glass cases along the hallways, so anyone walking through could glimpse the man behind the name. When the day finally came to open the doors, Serena stood on the front steps, a handmade sign resting against the railing. Painted in bold letters, it read, "The Whitmore House, a place for community." Her younger brother held the sign upright, grinning despite the sweat dripping from his brow after days of work. The first to arrive were seniors from the neighborhood, some leaning on walkers, others led by grandchildren. They paused in awe at the sight of the mansion's restored interior. Then came families with children, wide-eyed as they stepped into the space that felt like a blend of history and welcome. Serena greeted each of them by name when she could, shaking hands, guiding them to the dining room where volunteers had prepared warm meals. A piano student from the high school sat nervously at Harold's old instrument, then began playing soft melodies that carried through the halls. The sound filled the house with warmth Harold himself might have approved of. Ah! Serena caught herself, smiling, not because everything was perfect, far from it, but because the place had found its purpose. The first week. Meals were served daily. Seniors gathered in the study to read newspapers and play chess. Children filled the long dining table with crayons and notebooks, tutors helping them with homework. Music lessons sprang up in the parlor, laughter echoing down the corridors where silence had once ruled. The Whitmore house had become what Serena had envisioned, not hers, not Harold's, but everyone's. Late one evening, after most had gone home, she walked alone through the mansion's halls. She paused at Harold's portrait above the fireplace, studying the dignified figure she had once known only as a frail old man with trembling hands. The air carried faint traces of dinner and the lingering sound of children's laughter.
"We
did it," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "They'll remember you now." For the first time in her life, she felt she was building something not just for survival, but for legacy. Harold's legacy had become hers to carry, and through the Whitmore house, it had grown into something larger than either of them. It was not wealth, not inheritance in the usual sense, but a living story, unfolding one shared meal and one warm laugh at a time. And in that moment, standing in the quiet glow of the old house now filled with new life, Serena knew she had made the right choice. The morning of the opening dawned brighter than Serena had expected, the sky clear and sharp, as though the world itself had polished it for the occasion. She arrived before anyone else, walking slowly up the stone steps of the mansion with her, palms pressed against the wood of the railing, steadying herself. The house no longer felt like the hollow relic it had been when she first stepped inside weeks earlier. The paint smelled fresh, curtains hung clean in the tall windows, and the front lawn had been trimmed into something resembling order. For the first time, the Whitmore house looked ready to receive company again. Serena paused at the doorway. Clutching the small stack of papers in her hand, she had written down a few notes for a speech, though she knew she would hardly follow them word for word. She had never been the kind to address crowds, but today wasn't about comfort. Today was about Harold, about honoring his memory in a way that would breathe beyond both their lives. By mid-morning, the driveway and lawn began filling with cars and people. The diner staff arrived first, balancing trays of baked goods and thermoses of coffee, laughing nervously as they looked around at the high ceilings and polished floors. Her boss, who had once told her she was foolish to risk her life for an old man, patted her shoulder now, his eyes damp as though he struggled to find words. "You did this," he murmured. And for once, Serena had no reason to shrug off the compliment. Soon after came Harold's distant relatives. Dressed in somber suits despite the festive air, they stood clustered together, stiff and uncomfortable, their eyes scanning the crowd with a mix of suspicion and resignation. The inheritance still stung them, Serena knew. Yet even they could not deny the transformation that had taken place. The house was alive again, humming with voices, children darting across the porch, seniors smiling as they entered. For a few moments, even bitterness had no place to stand. Neighborhood families followed, some clutching their children's hands, others guiding their elderly parents inside. Volunteers had set out chairs in the main hall, and soon the space, filled with chatter, footsteps, and the smell of fresh bread carried in from the kitchen. Serena stood near the fireplace, watching it all unfold, her heart beating so fast it seemed to shake her ribs. This was no longer just her idea, it was reality. When the crowd settled, someone tapped a spoon against a glass, drawing attention toward her. Serena stepped forward, her notes trembling in her hand, though she didn't look down at them. Instead, she let her gaze sweep across the room, faces she knew from the diner. Neighbors who had once been strangers, Harold's relatives, and people who had simply heard about the place and come to see it for themselves. "I don't know how to begin," she admitted softly, her voice carrying further than she expected in the high-ceilinged room. "I'm not someone who usually gives speeches. I've spent most of my life bringing coffee, balancing plates, and trying to make sure the bills got paid on time. But someone once told me that legacy isn't about what you keep, it's about what you give." The room grew still, every ear tilted toward her. Serena swallowed hard and went on. Harold Whitmore was not just a man who sat by the diner window. Every morning, he carried stories, memories, and a kindness that few people ever saw. When he left this world, he left me something I didn't expect. Not just a house, not just money, but trust. He trusted me to do something good with what he could no longer carry. She paused, her throat tightening. "Don't take that lightly." She gestured to the walls around them, to the piano polished and gleaming in the corner, to the rows of chairs filled with people who looked more like a family than strangers. "This house isn't mine, it's yours. It belongs to every child who needs a place to learn, to every senior who needs a place to be remembered, to anyone who feels they have nowhere else to go. We call it the Whitmore House, not to honor wealth or property, but to honor a man who believed kindness was worth more than either." Applause rose, hesitant at first, then swelling as people stood and clapped. Serena lowered her eyes, humbled, her cheeks burning. She hadn't expected the warmth that poured back toward her. Even Harold's relatives, though stiff, offered polite nods, some with expressions softened by the weight of her words. Afterward, the doors were opened wide, and the crowd moved through the rooms, exploring what had been built. Children ran their fingers across the piano keys. Elders lingered over the glass cases of Harold's old photographs, and neighbors shared food in the dining hall. Serena moved among them quietly, shaking hands, answering questions, and soaking in the sound of life echoing through the mansion's halls. For the first time since, Harold had placed his trembling hand over his coffee cup and whispered that she reminded him of someone he once knew. Serena felt certain she had fulfilled something larger than either of them. She was not just a waitress anymore. She was a bearer of a legacy, and the Whitmore house was the proof. The years had passed in ways Serena could hardly measure. Seasons shifted, buildings aged, faces changed in the neighborhood. But the little diner on the corner seemed to resist the march of time. Its red vinyl booths were still patched in places. The bell above the door still gave its cheerful jangle. And the smell of frying bacon and brewed coffee lingered as though it had been bottled up for decades. The place carried a comfort that no renovation could buy, and when Serena pushed open the door on that quiet morning, I felt as though she had stepped not into the present, but back into a chapter of her own history. She wasn't carrying an order pad anymore. No apron tied at her waist, no quick glance toward the clock to measure how many hours of her shift were left. Dead. She carried only a small purse and the weight of memories that brushed against her with every familiar sound and smell. She greeted the hostess with a smile, but the woman didn't recognize her. To the staff working that day, she was just another customer. That realization made her smile even more. Once, she had thought this diner defined her life. She knew it had simply been the place where a turning point waited. She asked softly for the booth by the window. The same one where Harold had sat for years, his cane leaning against the wall, his coffee cooling slowly as he gazed outside. The hostess nodded and guided her over, setting down a menu she didn't bother to open. Serena slid into the seat, the vinyl cushion creaking faintly under her weight. She rested her hands on the table, tracing invisible lines along the wood as though she might still feel the faint grooves left by Harold's fingers. The waitress who came to take her order was young, maybe no older than Serena had been when she worked here. Her hair was tied in a loose ponytail, her expression professional but tired. Serena recognized the look immediately, the look of someone balancing trays and dreams at the same time, never certain which would slip first. "Just coffee and toast," Serena said with a small smile. "Black, please." The words tasted familiar, borrowed from the man who had once ordered the same thing every morning. The waitress nodded, scribbled the order, and disappeared. When the food arrived, Serena didn't touch it right away. She sat with her coffee steaming in front of her, staring out the window as Harold had done, watching the street come alive with people, walking dogs, children chasing each other, and cars pausing at the intersection. The world looked much the same, but Serena felt the difference in herself. She had lived through nights of fear, mornings of doubt, and days of unexplainable grace. Harold had once told her she reminded him of someone he lost, and she had carried those words through every decision she made after. The waitress returned to check on her, and Serena stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Could you do me a favor?" she asked. The young woman blinked, cautious, and Serena smiled reassuringly. "Give me the bill for everyone having breakfast this morning. Don't tell them who paid, just let them enjoy their meal." The waitress hesitated, her eyes widening, then slowly nodded, scribbling on her pad. "Of course," she whispered. As Serena watched her walk away, she felt a calmness spread through her chest. Years ago, Harold had tried to press money into her hand for helping him. She had refused, telling him kindness wasn't for sale. Now, she understood what he had been trying to do. He hadn't been paying her. He had been passing something on. A reminder that generosity carried forward, that family wasn't always born of blood, but of the choices people made to stand beside one another. She lifted the coffee cup, closing her eyes briefly as the bitter warmth touched her lips. She could almost hear Harold's voice across the booth, soft and measured, filled with that quiet dignity she had seen before anyone else noticed it. "You reminded me of family," he had said. The words echoed as though the walls themselves had memorized them, offering them back to her now. By the time she left, the morning rush was beginning. Customers were laughing, forks clinking against plates, the doorbell chiming again and again. No one looked her way as she slipped out, the door closing softly behind her. They didn't need to know who had bought their breakfast. It was enough that they felt, even for a moment, that someone cared. Serena stepped onto the sidewalk. The sun rising higher, light spilling across the street in golden stripes. She walked away from the diner with a steady pace, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The mansion was still waiting, the community center alive with children and seniors. But here in the booth by the window, she had come full circle. It was the quiet completion of something that had begun with a simple cup of black coffee and an old man's kind eyes.